Okay, so a very warm welcome to this panel. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Eva Jung. I'm an investigative reporter in Copenhagen, Denmark, and I also sit on the board of the GIJN, who's organizing this conference. So this panel will be about the new organized crime. And today's globalized organized crime poses extraordinary challenges for journalists, which is why the GIJN has produced a reporter's guide on how to investigate organized crime. We've been publishing some excerpts from this guide during the last few months. And as of yesterday, Monday, the full guide was available on the GIJN's website. It has 9 chapters, and we will make sure to link to the guide here in the chat. So today we have with us 3 panelists who have all written chapters for this guide, and we have asked them to give you an insight into how to investigate organized crime in their field of expertise. So these 3 experts have investigated criminal enterprises from finances and disappearances to the black market in antiquities, and they are joining us from Mexico, Romania, and the Netherlands. I also want to make sure that you all know this session is being recorded. And I also want to make sure that every question that you might have is very welcome. And we will be saving all of these questions until the end, making sure that also if anyone has any questions left, our panelists have been so kind as to say they will also be, it will also be possible to send them some questions. So let's have an introduction of our panelists. With us today, we have Paul Radu. Paul Radu is a co-founder and Chief of Innovation at the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, the OCCRP. He founded the organization back in 2007 along with Drew Sullivan, and he leads major investigation and projects at the OCCRP. He scopes the regional expansion and develops new strategies and technology to expose organized crime and corruption across borders. Paul has held a number of fellowships all over the world, and he has probably won all the major journalism awards out there. So we would also like to introduce today our second panelist, who's called Marcella Turati from Mexico. Marcella will be joining us today with a pre-recorded video about her area of expertise, which is forced disappearances. She is a Quinto Elemento Lab co-founder, which is an independent nonprofit organization dedicated to support and doing investigative journalism in Mexico and to train journalists in Mexico to have better skills. She has been covering these enforced disappearances of people since 2000, and she's the coordinator of Donde van los, sorry for my Spanish, Donde van los disappearances. It's a project dedicated to investigate the patterns of this phenomenon and the cases around it. And she, of course, as well as Paul Radu, Marcella Turati has written one of the profiles in this guide that we will learn more about today. And last but not least, joining us is Donna Yates, who is an associate professor of criminal law and criminology at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. She is an archaeologist by training, and she studies the transnational illicit trade in antiquities, arts, and fossils. And she has a particular focus on the nexus between organized crime and white-collar crime. So she is also a founding member of the Trafficking Culture Research Consortium, which conducts empirical research on antiquities trafficking. And she's the author of numerous publications on the topic. One of her books is called Trafficking Culture, New Directions in Researching the Global Market in Illicit Antiquities. So I'm very excited about hearing from our three panelists today, and very welcome all three of you. Paul, I would like to offer you the mic now to hear what you have to tell us today.
Thank you, Eva, and hi all. I'm very glad to be in this great company with this panel. You know, I was when I was invited to write a chapter in this handbook, I was really glad that GIJN is giving a lot of attention to this topic. Investigating organized crime is now is not an easy feat. It's actually hard work, and I think this handbook will help journalists and activists around the world, you know, do a bit more work on such an important issue. And now, just a few considerations, you know, on organized crime and the work we do at the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. So first of all, you know, I'm really lucky to work in the company of hundreds of investigative reporters from all over the world. Hundreds of, you know, of investigative reporters and editors, tech people who are all focused on investigating, you know, this scourge, this organized crime that works hand in hand with politicians all over the world to destroy democracy and to ruin livelihoods of so many. Now, you know, this panel is called the New Organized Crime, but the reality is that with a few notable exceptions, investigative reporters have not worked very thoroughly when it comes to organized crime. So it's rather that us as investigative reporters are new at investigating organized crime in a manner that really explains to the public what's really going on globally. When I'm saying this, I'm including our work at OCCRP in this same basket, because we're working on organized crime for the past 20 years. And only, I'd say, in the past 5-6 years, we really understood the extent at which criminals, you know, transcontinental criminals, are affecting, you know, global processes, from, you know, global supply chains to all sorts of violence to all sorts of trafficking, contraband, and so on and so on. So we're still playing a little bit of a game of catch up here. If you look at organized crime, in my point of view, what you see is that they're really well organized, you know, across continents for the past decades. Sometimes, you know, we look back at trafficking networks and human smuggling networks that were started in the 70s, in the 60s, and they're still going on strong. So what this means is that the criminals built infrastructure over a long period of time, while journalists, you know, our collaborative type of reporting has been built only, you know, let's say in the past 15 years in a manner that really, you know, corresponds to the public's needs. And we're still, you know, we still have a lot of work to do to collaborate across borders efficiently. So now, what we've done at OCCRP is that we try to deconstruct organized crime. And what you're seeing is that, first of all, major organized crime is always across borders, always operate across continents, across countries, across frontiers, across digital borders, not just physical borders. You know, they operate from server to server, from server farm to server farm, and so on and so on. And that once they put in place infrastructure that, again, was sometimes built, you know, decades ago in the 60s, 70s, 80s, they use that infrastructure for all sorts of crime. So what we're seeing is not, you know, organized crime groups that are specialized only in trafficking in humans, you know, or in smuggling of historical artifacts, or in I don't know, cocaine trafficking. Once they have the infrastructure, they try to integrate a sum of crimes, a diversity of crime, because why not? You know, they do have. And when I'm saying the infrastructure, I'm referring to two main things. One is the physical infrastructure. You know, criminals, in order to move their merchandise, to move the illegal goods, to do the illegal trade, they need shipping companies, they need trucking companies, they need shipping lanes, they need, you know, airplanes, they need a lot of logistics, you know, that, again, they've put in place over a long period of time. This doesn't mean that they're not opportunistic. They're using whatever comes handy. But if you look at the criminal groups that are most successful in the world, from the Italian mafias, the Mexican organized crime groups, to the Colombians, to everybody, you see that they've built their own infrastructure, that they put together their own logistical kind of ways. So once you kind of see this global setup that they've managed to realize, to build, you see that, you know, over time, they've added new layers of crime to their original crime. So you might see today, you know, drug traffickers who used to do drug trafficking in the 80s, being involved in large-scale money laundering and offering these services to other criminal groups. So there are interconnections between groups that work with each other, you know, and do all sorts of crimes. And it even got to the point where I'm seeing what I call criminal angel investors. What this means is you're seeing these criminals who have been very successful, who amassed a lot of capital, and now are sponsoring other criminal groups, because the return on investment when it comes to crime is a lot higher than, you know, compared to legit business. So these criminal angel investors are fueling right now, you know, all sorts, and are breeding all sorts of criminals, you know, that and it's actually very interesting, because these are really like investors like you see in Silicon Valley, for instance. You know, they see that someone is successful, you know, in, for instance, smuggling cocaine. They will contact that person or that group, and they will say, look, we got this money and we want to sponsor you to go, you know, the next level. So they're kind of scaling their business as they go. And this brings more return to the criminal angel investors, while also, you know, giving more leverage and more power to the criminal groups that are emerging. So there is a little bit of a gap when it comes to the age of you know, criminals who are doing this for a long time, but the old criminals are sponsoring the new. So this kind of follow on when it comes to crime, this kind of line that connects the past and the future is where we need to direct our attention very, very well, and where we need to be very focused, because only by understanding how organized crime operated in the 70s, in the 80s, we'll be able, you know, last century, we'll be able to see how the new organized crime operates now, and how they improved, and how they've become more digital. Now, in the chapter I wrote, I'm also referring to, you know, cryptocurrencies a little bit, and I'm referring to the future of organized crime. But it's really, really about understanding, you know, how criminals work across this infrastructure. And it's crucial, in my opinion, to also see how criminals are aided, are helped by others, you know, and we call these others the criminal services industry. And in the handbook, I'm writing a little bit about banks who help criminals, bankers, you know, offshore type of companies, formation agents who form these companies for the criminals, lawyers who work for the criminals, hackers who work for the criminals, former law enforcement who are in the service of criminals, because criminals pay very, very well. So it's really important to understand this criminal services industry and the whole universe around crime and corruption. And allow me to share my screen just for 2 minutes to show you what I'm proposing in order to kind of deconstruct, to kind of understand a little bit better how we view organized crime. And this is a concept that I'm calling the people and the deeds concept, where you'll find the document attached to the file section of this talk in Pathable, and it's really about seeing the people involved in organized crime and the people affected by organized crime and the deeds of everybody. So, you know, when we look at the criminal group, we see the mobsters, we see sometimes the criminal angel investors, we see the assassins that might be assigned, you know, to inflict violence, you know, and death. We see the lawyers assisting them. We see the technicians who help them put in place technical infrastructure. And when I'm saying technical infrastructure, I'm referring, for instance, to ISPs, to internet service providers. Criminals have their own ISPs, you know, that they have in their pocket and that they control. I'm referring to Bitcoin farms or other cryptocurrency farms that help criminals, launder money and generate more income. I'm referring to the politicians who help them sometimes by changing the laws under which the criminals might be indicted. We've seen many cases of laws being changed by politicians who are in the pockets of criminals. I'm talking about proxies that are used, sometimes stolen identities, and so on and so on. Judges who unfortunately sometimes are in the pockets of these people. And then the deeds. And you can have here crime 1, crime 2, crime 3. We basically have these columns and these lines where you have the intersections between the criminals themselves and the crimes. But it's really important to not just look at the crimes themselves, but to look at how the criminal group is investigated by law enforcement. It's very important to look at how the criminal group inflicts pain upon citizens and so on. So all this universe is a little bit different than what, for instance, the police do. The police, they just investigate the crime. They go after the crime, and they prosecute it, and sometimes a few people end up in jail and some money gets seized. But in fact, what they're doing is they're allowing the other parts of the criminal group to still go about business as usual. And this is something that us as journalists serving the public, we need to kind of do differently. We need to show how and why and for how long, and we also kind of have to see what's the future of organized crime. I think this is where we need to put our eggs in a big basket, where we all sit together, and quantify what we do in terms of impact, and really go after organized crime, because there's very brave journalists out there who are doing work, but there's not enough of those journalists who are taking risks, and especially in the Western world, where these criminals are laundering the money, where you don't really see the violent crime, where you don't really see the suffering. I think that's the journalists in the West need to work alongside the journalists in the East, in the South, in the global South, everywhere, to understand the extent to which organized crime is affecting all these lives. And I think I'll stop here, and I'll be very glad to share any other thoughts and insights. And I'm very curious about your opinion on organized crime and how this affects your journalism, your work, and the citizens whom you're actually serving. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Paul. And now we will move on to this presentation by Marcella Turati, which have been filmed already before meeting today. And let's hear from Marcella.
Hello. Unfortunately, today I can't be with you, but this is my presentation. I am a Mexican journalist, and I have been covering disappearance people since 20 years ago. First of all, we have to know that organized crime groups need to control territories, routes, and everything that is inside of these regions. They need to control economy, people, and all the things and all the natural resources that are inside. For them, this is part of the business, and they need people. So they silence the people who are disturbing the business, and also sometimes they kill them, sometimes they disappear them, sometimes they only threaten. And we know in Mexico that many times they exhibit their killings, but in recent times, in like a decade ago, they start disappearing people. They know that they don't want to calentar la plaza, don't hit the territory. It means don't attract attention, and if they have a lot of murders, a lot of bodies in the streets, if they kill a lot of people, they will be retaliated or chased by police. So they need to disappear all the truths, and that include human bodies. No? For investigate this kind of disappearances, we have to understand some of the modus operandi, how they work. This is, for example, an investigation that we publish in Quinto Elemento Lab, where the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación was recruiting young people, poor young people. They offer via Facebook or social networks, WhatsApp, jobs, and they offer to be bodyguards of people. They offer good salaries, and many young people who go and see what kind of job it is, they don't appear again, no, and they are working as slaves. This is, for example, some of the, in that place that is Tala near Jalisco, some of the families, some of the people who have disappeared, young and mostly men who are working for them. But also we know that sometimes they kill people and they dig mass graves to hide their victims. This is, for example, one map of mass graves that we did. We collect the information of how this new method has been used by cartels, but also by police, militaries, security force in Mexico. So when you go and you are tracking and investigating the disappearance of people, everything, every mass grave is an evidence. No? Everything, every piece, every cloth, all the belongings and all the things that are that you can find, there are evidences that the police have to collect, but you can start creating a database with many of this information, because all this information allow in the future maybe to identify somebody who is disappeared. Other thing that we have learned is that many of the statal actors, many of the former militaries, former Marines, they train cartels, drug cartels, to disappear people, to torture, to murder. So this is not a new methodology, but every time these groups have been refined their methodologies, their techniques, and sophisticated. Now we know, for example, that they don't anymore buried people, buried corpse. They now use acids and dissolve the bodies. No, so every time and passing the years, they have refined this methodology to don't leave any trace, and don't leave human bodies, and to disappear almost completely the human bodies. So, and also it's really difficult to investigate, because many crimes can be involved when you are tracking for a missing people, no, for a forcibly disappear people. So it can be kidnapping, human trafficking, forced recruitment, slave work, organ removal, murder. These can be all involved. So you don't know many times where you can start investigating. And the other complication is that when someone is disappeared, the whole territory is silenced, and the relatives and the friends and the community, and they don't want to talk, because they feel really they feel terror. No, so there is not a single investigative technique to do it, but I will share some of the things that we in Mexico have learned And also I learned from many of you in other conferences. First, you have to map the territory. You have to know what the internal dynamics inside, the complicities, how the government, because there is always some official people from the government who are helping these groups or are working with this group or are part of these groups. You always need, or these groups, the organized crime groups, need this complicity to act and to control certain territory. So you have to draw a map with the stakeholders, with the dangers, and you have, before you enter, you have to collect enough information and determine which sources you will touch and approach first, second, and at the end. You have to know a lot of this territory, and collect them a lot of information that what is happening inside, and also the modus operandi. No? For example, this that I told you, how they recruit people, what kind of people. When somebody disappears, you need to react quickly, act quickly, trace back, reconstruct last known moments. No? For example, and it's really, really important, we have a lot of social media and all the traces. If the people who disappear use Uber, make a phone call, post some Facebook note, or share with somebody location, whatever. Everything can help in these first moments. But this information almost always is belonging to the family, to the relative of these people. So you have to cooperate, or you have to approach to them, and they will know if they will share with you this information. Many times it's really difficult because they are really afraid if this is a kidnapping, or they don't know what happened, if they will receive a phone call that are asking for money. No? But it's important, like in a public event, when there are a lot of victims involved. For example, this is a screenshot. It says, "Mom, please, can you put money in my phone? It's urgent." And this is a final call or message from one of the 43 students who were kidnapped and disappeared in Mexico in 2014 by municipal police and drug cartels, no? Working together with police, federal police, and with soldiers supervising this operation. So if you have all these, you can have access to the different locations where the cell phones communicate. You can have some track, and you can trace a path. For example, this is from Reuters. This is I know that you know this investigation, but the people who were killed by police in this drug war in Philippines. So all the cameras, they are at witness, really important, but you have to be almost the first who go and to collect this information, to look for survivors, to ask neighbors who saw something, and also use technology. And this picture, this is in Ciudad Juarez. Those girls are women who were disappeared. No? They were outside a hotel. She's one of them. And they were as sex slaves in this hotel. And Google Street View could focus on them when they, and this is one of the captors, this man with them. So sometimes you have to imagine how I can approach to go inside to a place that is really controlled, because these kind of operations are in places or neighborhoods or municipalities that are under control of this group of organized crime. And you have to think different ways of approach. For example, the satellitary imageries we can see now here in this AP investigation of the slaves in the fishing industry. And all these things you have to create a database and order chronologically and put inside all the kind of clues that you collect. It's important, go to the work field, go do work field, go to the places and look for the traces, but sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes you always will need help of people inside these places, but you have to be aware of, don't put them on risk. No? All kind of maps, for example, this is a map of the 43 students, the different places that the people say that they were, that were involved, where it happened, the different things. There are the 43 students that now they are, we almost know, we only know about 40 of them. We are still looking, searching for them, where they are. Not all, and sometimes they can be alive. Not everybody is dead. So for that reason, it's really important the first moments. This, for example, is a place where the government said that the students were burned in a dump. So Argentinian forensic anthropological team, they track using Google Earth the different places, this dump, to demonstrate that that day there was not fire, and the fire or the other evidences that the government present, they were from other years. No, so we can approach in different ways, and we can enter in different ways, even not going to the places, but we can look for other kind of evidences to build these cases. No? We have to do like forensic architecture, different timelines, chronologies, when the stories are really complex and you have different scenarios, different people involved. No? Also, we can collect different evidences, testimonies. We have to look for all the witness possible in audios, records, but also people. And mainly in these cases, it's the kind of cases you have the relatives, you can approach the relatives, and almost always they are the ones who are looking for and collecting data and investigating. So you can be with them, but you also have to know that you have to verify every information that they can give you, everything that you listen that they know, you have to verify. And also you have to stop and don't publish the information if it can be danger, can mean danger for somebody. No? So the relatives, the people in field, they almost always have information, but you have to be aware, because not all the people always tell the truth, and as journalists we know. It's really important also if we go with survivors, with other witnesses, with people who were inside. And these people talk, but when they are outside, if they are displaced, if there is people who is in prison, who are not inside the territory, is kind of easier to bring, to talk with them and to convince them to give their testimonies. But also you have to be careful of this information, of the identities and everything. But looking for the survivors, many of them who are displaced, is important. They can tell you more things about it. The time is important. If the time passes, sometimes you at the beginning, the people are really, really afraid they can't speak, but you have to, the time pass, and so sometimes that the people start talking. You have to protect the identities of the people, and so the people in one moment can talk. For example, this is from 1 month ago. This is a community, Indian community, Yaqui, in the north of Mexico. They were looking for the 10 men who were disappeared in the community by the people from a cartel. And yes, the family, the wife, the daughters, and the children were really afraid of giving their names. But in one moment they needed the press and they wanted to speak and they asked for help. So, but in this kind of investigations, you have to be careful. You are not police. If you make a mistake, the victim can be retaliated against or can be disappeared again and moved from another place or can be killed. So it's like really difficult also if you collect some of the evidence that the police will need. And if you don't give a juice or don't tell police what do you have, maybe this case will never be solved. So you have to think every step you do, you take, because sometimes you cannot help to the investigation. You can you can compromise the investigation, but going first to investigate. Also, you have to be always aware of your safety, your own safety. You are intromising in a millionaire business, and you can be a really big problem for this kind of groups. So they have money, they have power. You have to be really aware of what you do first, and how you take care of the information, where did you keep it, and how you also take care of yourself. And the other things is the same as other investigations. You have to talk with different sources, look for open sources, judicial documents, police, prosecutors, but in places like Mexico and other places around the world where the police is compromised and really is working for another kind of interest, you have to be really careful of what you share, and you have to you have to verify even the victims' testimonies. You have to verify, look for facts, look how you can prove. Sometimes when there is a body and the government, or you can say that you can say that this is the body of the people who was missing. You can't do it. You can't give this scoop or have this scoop, because if you don't have genetic confirmation, DNA test, you are not the one who can do it. And also the families, the relatives need the official information. So you have to also, in this kind of topics, there are not scoops, no? You have also to be sensitive with the victims, with the relatives, and you can't spoil also the investigation. But you can publish some parts of your investigation and fish for more information. Sometimes there are people who knows more, and then they see, they read your investigation, and they contact you to give you more. And almost at the end, we, in this kind of investigation, we have to always fight against impunity. And this always will be like really important that you have in mind, that impunity will try to stop your investigation, that there are judges that are corrupt, politicians, prosecutors, also scientific people, the people who give you information can change evidences, because many times in our countries, our governments are working with these groups, with these cartels, with these organized crime groups. So you have to be, for that reason, like really careful and verify everything. And at the end, another of the knowledge of this kind of work, you have to be always be careful of yourself, your digital, physical, spiritual, and emotional security. You have to have some kind of procedures, protocols to don't burn out, to also to be safe. It is possible. And my final recommendation is always think in the potential risks to the victims, the people to interview. Also, don't reveal any information that can spoil police investigation. And remember to always keep your sources, your investigation, and yourself safe. That is the most important in this kind of investigations. And those are my contact information, the organization. I am working, or I am a coordinator of this news website about that investigate missing people and all the enforced disappearances. And thank you for the invitation, and that's what I can share with you. Thanks.
And thank you so much to Marcella Turati and to all of the more than 160 people who has joined us today. I read some of you are from Nepal, and there's one from Haiti. It's great to have people from all around the world. So it's time for our third panelist, Donna Yates from Maastricht University. Welcome, Donna.
Hi, thank you for having me, and thank you for inviting me to this conference. It's the first time I've been to an investigative journalism conference. I'm a little bit nervous, but we'll see how it goes. But I was really excited to be invited, and mostly I was really excited to be invited to contribute to the guide. Because in my field, which is studying the global illicit trafficking and cultural objects, so antiquities and art, investigative journalism has made almost an indescribable contribution to this field. And just a moment ago, I went over to my bookshelf to pick out books by investigative journalists, and I come up with this gigantic stack here, and that's just as many as I could carry, and I can see at least 12 more. And many of these are kind of the foundational texts in my field. So this is from 1967, one is from 1974. I assign these to students, and they're the basis of a lot of my own research. So anything I can do to encourage investigative journalism in this area is certainly worth my time, and I'm very excited to do so. I was very excited also to see Paul's talk, and I instantly wanted to change everything that I was going to say to talk more about what Paul was talking about. But I'll stick with what I was doing, and perhaps in the discussion afterwards, we can bring these topics together. But I'm just going to share my screen now. Let's see, there it is. And hopefully that's visible. So today, I'm not going to walk you directly through my guide. You can read my guide. What I wanted to do today is just present one in-depth case study of recent antiquities trafficking that was basically exposed by spectacular investigative journalism. So you can see some of the key structures and players in this. And again, hopefully spark discussion, because there really is a lot of crossover with what you were saying, Paul. So I'm very excited to hear that. So moving right along, let's see. There we go, now it's moving. Especially following the talk that just happened, I often feel out of place on panels about trafficking. I often present with people who are smuggling human organ or studying the smuggling of human organs, of narcotics, of weapons, of people. And when it comes to cultural objects, antiquities, artworks, immediate danger to person, to people, is not usually immediately evident. It can often feel like a victimless crime that doesn't hurt anybody. And the harms of this type of crime just really seem less harmful, because honestly, we're talking about people dying. However, the social harms of this type of crime are strong and salient. This is a transnational crime that connects destructive theft at our most important and sacred cultural sites to the elite world of the global art market through a web of organized crime. That's pretty spectacular. Cultural objects tend to be stand-ins or symbols of cultures and communities. They're real components of identity and linchpins of community cohesion. As in the case I'm going to show you, they can be holy, they can be living gods. And often the plunder and destruction of these objects comes hand in hand with the plunder and destruction of the communities that hold them sacred. There's a lot of ties between the looting of cultural objects and, say, genocide. We just discussed Guatemala quite a bit, which is an area where I work. And the plunder of cultural objects has been the hallmark of dominance and control for millennia. These are spoils. This is the obliteration of culture. And really, the illicit trade in cultural objects redefines shared cultural heritage, this important shared outpouring of humanity's creativity as a commodity that can be bought and sold. It denies culturally appropriate access to and use of these items. It prevents scientific research into our ancient past. And in response, understandably, many countries have criminalized the removal and marketing of antiquities, particularly countries that historically have been hit quite heavily by antiquities trafficking. So I believe that the antiquities trade is an exploitative system. In the most basic level, and I'm running through this quickly, it takes heritage objects out of the hands of the many and places them in the hands of the few. Source countries tend to be lower income countries. Market countries tend to be wealthy countries. And this is just symbolic of global power imbalance. And to be clear, there's no black market for antiquities and no white market for antiquities. There is one market for antiquities, and it's impossible to distinguish between fully legal and illicit antiquities on the market and illicit antiquities. It's a gray market. These illicit and illicit supply streams are mixed to such an extent that basically no one can separate them. So I note that a lot of reporting on antiquities trafficking is discussed mostly in relation to conflict and to disaster. And yes, these types of events are linked to the breakdown in security and control and the economic desperation that leads to looting. But this is a long-standing global problem. And it's a problem that even in these locations that have experienced conflict and disaster, use the long-standing pre-existing supply networks that Paul discussed before. They just kind of kick into high gear sometimes at this time. And I've specifically chosen a case study today that doesn't have anything to do with conflict or disaster, and yet it is a global illicit network that was trafficking in antiquities. So the case I'm going to talk to you is I'm calling it the Stolen Shiva because that sounds very exciting. And this is really where I wanted to come back to Paul, at least for a moment, because of the point he made about like I said, the infrastructures that move these items. The idea that antiquities flow through pre-existing trafficking channels that move in other goods is absolutely and positively the case. We've seen this, for example, in my project's research on the Thai-Cambodia border with the movement of Cambodian statues into Thailand. Absolutely the case. It's not the case in this particular case, but it's usually the case. So in a way, this is sort of an exception here. And second, I was really excited by, did you call it the criminal services agencies? These kind of facilitators throughout the market that allow organized crime to work. That these agencies are also throughout this case, but I didn't include them because I didn't think about it that way. But they really are all through this story. What is in this story, at least at the end, are people who maybe serve a similar function. They're facilitators of organized criminal networks. And indeed, they are parts of organized criminal networks. They're the final receivers of the proceeds of organized crime, but they themselves don't realize that they're that, or don't see their actions as criminal, and yet they are in many ways driving the creation of some of these networks, and at least are participating in them. In this particular case, some of those participants in the organized criminal network are major national museums. So they're often very surprised to find out that they are in league with organized criminals, but in this area they often are. So without further ado, I'm going to walk through this case. So this is Subhash Kapoor. He was a dealer in antiquities. He's a naturalized US citizen. He traded in Manhattan starting in 1974. So 1974 is a long time ago. We're talking again about established pathways here. He mostly traded in South Asian artifacts, items from India, Nepal, and Afghanistan. And in this picture, which is his former gallery, you can see items from all of those countries. In 2005, Kapoor traveled to Tamil Nadu in India, and he met with an art dealer named Sanjeevi Ashokan. Kapoor specifically ordered Chola bronzes, these absolutely beautiful, I think 12th century Indian statues, to be stolen from Indian temples because they're very popular on the market. Without going into too many details, there is no way to export these from India. They are not sellable, they are not exportable, completely and totally unambiguously against the law. Ashokan decided to target remote temples in poor communities that are centuries old and have these statues in them, but because of issues related to unequal development and poverty, have poor security in these areas. One of these temples was the Sri Paranthan village temple, and I'm sorry with my terrible, terrible pronunciation, in Tamil Nadu. This temple was ancient, but at the time it was locked and disused because I believe there was a scorpion infestation. So the gods still lived there. It was still the community temple, but they were dealing with a scorpion problem, so the door was locked and people weren't regularly going in. Ashokan hired local thieves to rob it in January of 2006. They stole all 8 Chola bronze statues in 3 robberies, including an absolutely stunning Shiva as Nataraja, the cosmic dancer who dances the end of the universe. And this is actually a really big and heavy piece. It was the last one they stole, and it was very difficult for them to remove it. It's also the most valuable one. So Ashokan paid the thieves about $6,000. And what he ended up doing is he bought several new Chola-style statues, mixed them all together in a shipping container, got a permit through official corruption to export modern statues. And basically, Subhash Kapoor paid him about $30,000 for this shipment of the Nataraja. So $6,000 to $30,000, Ashokan's making a pretty good profit on that. So the statues moved in a quite roundabout way, and this tends to be common for various types of trafficking where you need to move goods away from the initial point of crime. And in this type of trafficking, particularly where you need to launder an item and create a believable backstory so that elite consumers can buy it. This needs to gain paperwork, gain a fake history, gain something believable. So the richest person you could imagine or the nicest museum in the world can openly consume this. This makes antiquities quite different from most illicit goods. So the Shiva started in Tamil Nadu. It was moved to the port of Hong Kong. It was shipped to London. Then it was shipped to New York in the United States and was eventually sold to buyers in Australia. So quite a lot of movement for the Shiva. But again, the people moving this were progressively moving them into easier or harder and harder ports to break into while gaining paperwork. The looters, like I said, got $6,000. The middleman got $30,000, and ultimately Subhash Kapoor sold the Shiva for $5,600,000. So again, he's doing pretty good on this for his $30,000 investment. So Subhash Kapoor, this is where things get interesting to me. This is where we move into the interface between an organized criminal network, albeit a kind of small one in this case, and our elite institutions who are participating in and facilitating this market. Kapoor contacted the National Gallery of Australia because he knew that the National Gallery was interested in buying Indian pieces, despite the fact that there's no way to legally export these Indian pieces. They visited Kapoor in New York to see the Nataraja, and Kapoor provided them with documents that showed that the Nataraja was out of India before 1970, which is the year that India unambiguously banned the trade in Indian cultural objects. These documents were fake. They didn't really check them out. The museum went through several steps to look as if they were investigating the Nataraja, but I think that those steps are questionable. I think that they definitely are questionable. So for example, the director set up an investigating committee to look into the statue, but it was entirely on paper and never met. Kapoor told them that the pieces were bought in 1970 from Delhi's Fine Art Museum. Well, the museum never contacted Delhi's Fine Art Museum to ask about this, which is good because it doesn't exist. And they were told that Kapoor bought them in the US from the widow of a Sudanese diplomat. And he gave her contact details. They never called her, but the museum said, well, they looked up her home on Google Earth, and because there was a real house there, they thought that was done. And as an aside, this is a perfectly nice house, but it's not the kind of house you expect a $5.6 million statue to be sitting in. And if I saw this as the address I was told, I would be worried. Clearly they weren't. They absolutely didn't contact the stolen idol wing of the Tamil Nadu police, the dedicated police force who investigates antiquities thefts in that state in India. The museum admitted that they did look on the Idol Wing's website where they share pictures of stolen antiquities in 2009 when the Nataraja was on there, but they said they thought it was a different Nataraja and again, didn't call. They also actually hired a lawyer who told them don't buy this thing, and then they fired the lawyer. So there were problems here. Looking more into what happened after that, the theft was discovered in India in 2008 when heritage officials actually came to install a screen to protect the statue. The statues were gone. Good police work. The initial thieves were caught within 6 days of the discovery of the theft. And they, of course, had no loyalty to anybody. They rolled on Ashokan, who was arrested in March of 2009. Again, working your way up this chain. Kapoor was then arrested in Germany in 2011, and he is now on trial in India still. This is problematic, obviously, on many levels. But as the result of Kapoor's arrest, there have been countless arrests in India, all of which have been really well reported in the Indian press, of all sorts of people who were supplying Kapoor, who were running parallel to Kapoor, who had kind of local dealerships that were tapping into this international system. And the police were able to get all of this from his emails and his phone. He didn't actually cover any of that up. Why should he? He had worked, he'd done this since 1974 and hadn't had a problem. Kapoor's warehouse in New York was raided in 2012, and 20 million worth of stolen goods were found there, including 3 Chola bronzes that were on Interpol's public database of stolen art. No way to argue you didn't know those were stolen. The US has seized over 100 million in assets from Kapoor alone. In 2019, the Manhattan District Attorney filed charges against him, and they are actively seeking his extradition. What was really important in this case is that there were actually photos of the Nataraja in the original temple context. And this kind of documentation is vital. Who bought from Kapoor? Well, absolutely the most elite of our institutions, as well as a number of very wealthy people, just to name a few. I like this headline: when the buying by museums stops, the looting stops. And then this has resulted in a lot of high-level returns of items associated with Subhash Kapoor, including the Shiva Nataraja in the center there, who is being received by Narendra Modi, brought by then Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott, who walked away with a uranium deal after that. So some idle diplomacy was going on there. And this is literally news this week, because the US returned 248 more looted items that they had seized from Subhash Kapoor's gallery to India this week, like within the last 7 days. So this is an ongoing this is an ongoing story, and I'll show you how in a couple other ways. And everything that I just told you came from investigative journalism, 100% from investigative journalism, and very specifically kind of a collaboration between a couple of really investigative journalists who are very interested in this topic, and a grassroots fans of Indian culture group called the India Pride Project, who are just normal people who take pictures of Indian statues and temples. And they absolutely expose this long-standing network in a way that couldn't be ignored. And it's been spectacularly done. And really, there's more, and there's more being revealed about this and the intricacies of this network, and indeed the connections of this network to the types of what did you call them again, Paula? The criminal service agencies that allow these things to happen. So in one example, when Australia was understandably investigating the loot in its public collection, they ended up returning some items that were sold by another Manhattan antiquities dealer named Nancy Weiner, including this beautiful Kushan Buddha. That's just one of them. Well, interestingly enough, this is dated October 5th, this month, or last month. Nancy Weiner pleaded guilty in New York to a number of charges related to antiquities trafficking. And in her plea, she admitted to buying things that had dirt on them, making up stories about where they came from, making up stories for other people, creating, engaging with people that she knew to be criminals and so on. So the idea that these kind of final elite people at the end of the chain don't know what they're doing, they're just, innocent people who got duped is really not believable. And indeed, Nancy Weiner and Subhash Kapoor and various other dealers in Asian art have been, through investigative reporting, been tied to really strange shell corporations and that hide assets and hide the financial flows that are kind of fueling this trade and so on and so forth. So really interesting work there. Another person involved in this that are tied in with Nancy Weiner, with Subhash Kapoor, is a man that has been on my project's radar for a very long time, a man named Douglas Latchford, who is recently deceased, but he featured very heavily in a lot of our work on Cambodia. He is, again, spectacular reporting this month, has been, his dodgy dealings are all throughout the Pandora Papers and so on. And it links, again, these high-end auction houses to really brutal looting of antiquities by former Khmer Rouge soldiers through this guy sitting in Thailand who also really liked bodybuilding. That was his thing. And this reporting is having absolute immediate effects on, if not necessarily instantly breaking up criminal networks, though it has done that, it's affecting returns. So again, October 16th, Denver Art Museum announces return of 4 artifacts to Cambodia after Pandora Papers coverage of indicted art dealer. So that's a museum responding to media coverage and making as right as can be something that was a very significant wrong. So that's all I have. Just one story, but I do encourage anybody interested in this topic to get in touch with me, and I'd be happy to provide you with any resources or contacts I can. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Donna. So, and thank you all of you that have written questions to us in the chat to our 2 panelists. We have got around 10 minutes left. We are able to go just a few minutes over time, but not more than just a few minutes. So let's hear from one of our questions. It was from Konstantina. I'm just trying to get the chat up here in my view. I remember Konstantina had a question for Paul, and how do I find it? Perhaps you also saw it, Paul. It was about whether you ever felt. Okay, here it is. She says, Konstantina writes, I'm a big fan of the work of the OCCRP. I have 2 questions. Have you ever been in danger or had to not publish because you were in danger? And how do you find information of all these criminal agents like lawyers and all? And do you confront them before publishing?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, these are great questions. They require, lengthy answers, but I'll try be very brief. So first of all, as I mentioned before, OCCRP is hundreds of investigative reporters and editors and others, working together. So what we do in terms of risk is we try to mitigate risk and to share the risk across the network. When we go into a dangerous situation, we make sure that our reporters know that they have the backing of the editors. We always know where our reporters are. We always make sure with the people that we're confronting that it's not just the reporter who confronts them that has the information that might be damaging to them, but it's the whole network, because the enemy in that case is the information, not the actual reporter. So the idea is that we're trying to find ways to minimize harm as much as possible. We put together infrastructure in place to protect our journalists from the fact that we have lawyers looking over our shoulders and looking at our actions and our writing and everything. We obviously have very thorough fact checking with our investigations. And then we have safety guides where our people are trained into detecting surveillance, for instance, which is almost always something that's followed by violence. So there are things that are put in place by OCCRP to protect against harm. Now, whenever we whenever we feel that we are at that stage of the investigation where we need to approach dangerous people, we put these safeguards in place. And in order to identify this, criminal services industry, you again have to look at the ecosystem, the criminal universe that's shaped around crime. I think Donna, just talked about this case that spread all over the world and showed the role of these, criminal agents working hand in hand with the organized crime groups and with the layers of crime, from the foot soldiers in India all the way to the people profiting big from this type of looting of artifacts. So that's this was a great example of what's going on. And once you understand this universe, what you can see is that the pattern will repeat itself. You just try to create a sort of a matrix where you identify the important parts of a crime, and then you go and apply the same matrix, over other geographies. What happens in India will happen in Syria, will happen in Eastern Europe, will happen in the US, because criminals and crime is almost always the same, with a little bit of a local flavor. But these transcontinental networks, the reason they work is that they try, they try models that have already been proven to be consistent, to yield a lot of outcome, a lot of money.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. And let's have a question for Donna as well. So, Donna, we have a question from Dami Lola, I think. The question is, can you speak a bit about the connection with historical artifacts in the British Museum and illicit trafficking, particularly when it relates to the repatriation of these artifacts?
Well, I warn that I study contemporary crime. I study crime that happened, you're seeing it in the papers today. I go back a little to sort of the 70s, a bit of the 60s. But the trafficking of historical artifacts and the ties to colonialism control are interesting. It's just not quite my field. The British Museum's a difficult and a strange case because to not go too far into it, they believe that it requires an act of parliament to change the certain aspects of the British Museum and other British museums to allow the return of any cultural objects that have entered their institution, and they stick to that. But I think, at least in relation to what I've been talking about, the salient power that these items that were stolen during colonial times and times of domination control still have is kind of emblematic about how important addressing contemporary organized crime around these pieces are. I know I've kind of danced around the topic of this. But frankly, just when it comes to both investigation and kind of the legal and social aspects of return, the return of colonial objects and the return of kind of recently stolen objects that move through organized criminal networks are quite a bit different. You're using kind of a different toolkit here.
Okay, it sounds like there's definitely some work to do still on the British Museum then. And Donna, just to remind everyone who's listening today as well, you made sure to sort of write all of your concrete tips also at the bottom of your guide. So please also remember to check that out. Also, we have a few other questions for Paul. Paul, it's difficult to answer very quickly, but could you please talk a bit more about the people who are financing criminals? You talked, for instance, about these, I think you called them criminal angel investors. And do you have some examples?
Sure. So we're seeing, from people who, from rogue states, for instance, who are kind of enrolling criminals to help them bypass sanctions. Like we've investigated, for instance, Iran, and the fact that they called up on organized crime to help them bypass, international sanctions on them. And they were paying a fee to these criminals. To actually organize crime groups who again amassed money, and we're seeing their names over and over again in court cases where they're backing, where they're financing other criminal groups to do contraband. We've seen quite a bit of these groups active in the tobacco industry, in the tobacco smuggling. And we're seeing them in other areas as well, because they the whole point of these criminal angel investors is that they want to diversify crime, and they want and they increase their money in that way.
Thanks a lot, Donna. There was also a question for you about the sort of transit countries.
Yeah, I don't see that question. Where is that one? Let's see.
Let's get back to, I think it will be the last question we will get to today. I think the speaker or the question was if you did any investigation sort of into the transit countries. You showed us the map. So how important are these transit countries to investigate when you do this sort of journalism?
That's a really, really good question, actually, and I'm glad somebody asked that. Because a lot of both academic research and reporting and even policing happens in source countries. Even though these tends to be the places where you can most easily define people as criminal and acts as criminal, they're kind of the easiest place to work. People are engaging in defined crimes. They're stealing stuff and smuggling stuff. But once you move into the sort of transit of these goods and then final markets for these goods, it gets a lot more difficult to investigate, and there are significant barriers. On the market side, the barriers come from people being white-collar actors, being sophisticated, being elite, being wealthy, being rich, having lawyers, having, again, this infrastructure of support and obfuscation that Paul talked about. At the lowest level, that doesn't necessarily exist. And when it comes to transit and movement of antiquities, and I imagine other objects, this is where the picture is the most cloudy. You have to be able to follow these items where they move, and you have to be able to understand what happens to them in the places that they stop, and the structural reasons why that thing has happened to them. So there's been very good research on certain transit ports for antiquities. For example, Hong Kong, one of my colleagues, Emmeline Smith, which I just note that somebody is asking about work on Nepal in this area, and that's something Emmeline's doing right now. So if you don't know Emmeline, get in touch with Emmeline. I think she's in Nepal right now. She did her whole PhD and subsequent research on Nepal, or not, sorry, on Hong Kong as a transit port for antiquities, why it's that, and what Hong Kong does. There's been interesting research on Israel serving as that, and as a result, Israel actually changed its laws and made it much harder to serve as a transit port. Switzerland did similar. The Geneva Free Port was once notorious for being filled with looted art and antiquities from around the world. But again, as a result of a significant amount of criticism, some of these books that I'm talking about, the policing followed. And also our own research has looked at Thailand as a transit port. This is where that guy I mentioned to you before, who was all over the Pandora Papers recently, was operating out of. And again, in the transit ports, at least for these trafficking networks, they're often somebody who has an extremely important role in laundering these items. They tend to be linchpins, people who, we call them Janus figures. They're people who have, like the Roman god Janus, have one head looking into the past of an object, one head looking into the future of the object. They know the illicit origins of this piece. They know the dirty networks it comes from, and they're able to transition them into cleaner, more elite spaces. Less the person you imagine as an organized criminal, and more who probably actually is an organized criminal. And we find that in some transit ports and in some transit locations, that's where these people are, that's where they're sitting.
Okay,
Donna,
Donna,
transit ports are important.
thanks a lot for answering this last question as well. Unfortunately, we have to end our panel now because our translators are leaving to translate other panels. But thank you so much for joining us today. I'll just remind you that both Paul Radu and Donna Yates are very happy to answer any questions that you might not already have gotten an answer to. And then hopefully next year we'll get to see some of all of you in person when there's another GIJC conference, and this time in Sydney. But thank you very much to all more than 160 of you who joined us today, and take good care.